Why are so many people getting duped by diet trends that actually shorten their lifespan?
I think one of the big reasons for that, and this is speculation and based on what I hear from people, obviously, I'm not sure that we have really good data on this at this point, but I think it largely has to do with the type of messaging around short term, quick fix type benefits. So when you look at, let's say, carnivore trend, for example, and that's an easy one, maybe to pick on. They're often promoting quick weight loss. They're promoting gut health, which there's a lot of elimination diets that may help in that respect. They're talking about those types of benefits that you might like subjectively experience very quickly, or I mean, with something like weight loss, obviously more objective, but that is potentially at the expense of these long-term outcomes like heart disease risk, cancer risk, 20, 30, 40 years down the road that aren't necessarily at the forefront of people's minds, especially when we're talking about a young population. I mean, a lot of these people that I see jumping on, say, the carnivore trend are those who are, in their 20s and 30s, young men in particular, and they want those sort of really quick fixes.
Yeah. And so how does something like the carnivore diet, what happens like from a cardiovascular perspective, from a longevity perspective, that actually leads to a decreased lifespan?
So while we don't have long-term data on carnivores specifically, we can make inferences based on what we know about the foods that they're including and excluding. So when we look at foods that they're including, obviously there's a heavy meat intake, especially red meat intake. And when we look at red meat consumption and say cardiovascular risk, we see very consistently that at a dose of about a serving a day, so about 100 grams or just over 4 ounces per day, is associated with higher risks of cardiovascular disease and all-cause mortality. Does that mean that having one or two servings a week is going to be problematic? Probably not. But with these carnivores, they're going to the far extreme of having multiple servings every single day, several servings a lot of the time. And when I discuss with some of them, they'll suggest that, well, the research that you have on red meat wasn't done in the context of this carnivore diet. And sure, I can grant that, but what they're ultimately suggesting is that we have, red meat consumption increases and risk increases, and then somehow it falls off a cliff. It just doesn't make a lot of sense from that perspective. Now, how that happens, I think there are multiple mechanisms at play. So for one, it's the saturated fat and cholesterol content. The saturated fat more than the cholesterol, although the cholesterol can have some effect, raising ApoB, and that can then increase the amount of plaque that you put down in the arteries and increase cardiovascular risk. And I'm not sure how much you've gone into that in the past, and I'm happy to sort of explore it more if needed. But that would be one mechanism. Other mechanisms potentially like heme iron intake might exacerbate or speed up the progression of atherosclerosis. There's some evidence for that. There's also associations between heme iron intake and cardiovascular events like heart attacks, but the evidence isn't necessarily as strong there as it is for some of those other variables. But then at the same time, what are you removing? I mean, you're removing fiber, which is arguably amongst the nutrients out there, the one that we have the most consistent data for benefit. And this is from everything to feeding the microbiome, to lowering blood lipids, to improving blood glucose regulation, and so on. And you're removing that aspect altogether. And then, of course, a lot of the phytochemicals and stuff that you would otherwise get from plants that also have like anti-cancer properties and so on. So, I mean, there's so much to explore in there that could be explaining this. But I think if I was to zoom out and just really broadly speak, I'd say you're really emphasizing intake of a particular group of foods that are consistently associated with higher risk, and you're removing or reducing the intake of foods that are very consistently associated with health benefit.
Yeah, I've seen people post online that I don't know if it was from Simon or maybe you posted it, but it was case studies essentially of people that did carnivore for a period of time, and later on they're like reaching out to people. I'm like, holy crap! Like my like health metrics have gone like crazy. Do you think that's a result of them just focusing on the short term gain and not on the long term downfalls of that diet?
Yeah, potentially. And now I'm not familiar with a ton of like published literature in that area, but there are certainly cases of individuals, very frequent cases of individuals who are struggling on a carnivore diet. And I think that is another issue with sort of the way that we're presented information on social media. So if we look at leaders of, say, the carnivore movement, they're often going to promote these positive anecdotes. Again, short term, but the positive experiences. If you actually go into virtually any like carnivore subreddit or Facebook page, you see negative upon negative upon negative experience of people asking for advice because they're struggling. But those aren't the benefits that are going to be promoted, or sorry, those aren't the experiences that are going to be promoted by those who just want to share the benefits. So I think there are a lot more people struggling out there that than you might see just based on following the Sean Bakers of the world or whoever. Um, but there are certainly many people struggling even in the short term, let alone the long term.
Yeah, and I think sometimes on social media, people they come they follow like it's almost like cult like a cult like thing where they could say pretty much anything and their followers would do it. And I think that's part of the reason why I think on both extremes, like if you have extreme veganism or extreme carnivore, I think that's why people follow these super extreme diets even when science contradicts it.
Yeah, that's certainly a part of it too, and they always find ways to sort of excuse the negatives. So a great example of this would be there was this guy Michael something who went by the Carnivore Kid. That was his like moniker online, and he had some type of cardiac scan. I think it might have been an angiogram. I can't recall exactly what, but found that there was significant occlusion of his LAD or his widowmaker artery. And that really freaked him out. And he was like, well, how could this be? I'm super fit, athletic. I'm young. He was around 40, I believe. Um, and he follows this carnivore diet, no carbs or anything. And, people to sort of remove the idea that carnivore contributed to that, they would say, oh, well, it happened before he jumped on carnivore, and in fact carnivore prolonged the time until this occurred. Or there's 50 plus beauty, a YouTuber who had a stroke, and it was a similar sort of idea. There's a bunch of people like Frank Tufano who struggled on the carnivore diet and now disparages it, but people come up with excuses for why that is. And of course the most famous example would be Paul Saladino, who really propelled carnivore into the limelight and then later stopped because he said his testosterone tanked and he was feeling like crap and not recovering from exercise or having cramps or something along those lines. So there, I don't know, like the community, those who are really stuck into that ideology will find ways to continue to give it the benefit of the doubt beyond what I think it deserves.
Yeah, because I think sometimes when you're in those echo chambers, it's really tough to get out because it almost like warps your mind in some psychological way, and you're convinced that no matter what people say, like it's automatically going to be accurate. Which I think is the problem with being so immersed in social media and not taking a step back and looking at things objectively. Speaking of that, like when people hear what you're talking about with regards to red meat, I think people tend to raise some more questions and they're like, what's the difference between processed red meat, unprocessed red meat? I would love for you to dive into that. And then maybe after that, like, is it the saturated fat in red meat or is it red meat specifically? Because I know there's leaner cuts of red meat that contain less saturated fat.
Yeah, great question, and I'd definitely like to get out of the carnivore talk too. I feel like that's almost like tackling the extreme. It was just an example, but yeah. So with red meat, for one, I also said it's dose dependent, right? So like a serving a week or something, 2 week or two per week, probably not a big deal. Daily is where I get more concerned. Now, as for the mechanisms, I talked about a few of them, but the lean meat question is interesting. So there was a really good trial by Bergeron and colleagues in 2019 where they compared red meat, which was lean, white meat, and plant protein sources. And what they actually did was they matched the saturated fat and fiber content of these diets. So they actually added certain fats from either dairy or like coconut products and so on to the plant protein group to ramp up the saturated fat a little bit. Still, it was lean red meat, but that still has a bit more saturated fat than like a lot of the plant protein sources. And they found that the plant protein resulted in lower ApoB than both the red meat and the white meat. So that suggests that red meat can still raise ApoB or LDL cholesterol relative to plant protein, but not to a massive, massive degree. Is it going to be better than a fatty cut of red meat? Yeah, very likely. Now, that is just looking at a biomarker. And if we want to look at, well, does it actually increase risk of having, say, a heart attack or a stroke or even premature death or earlier death? We can look at substitution analyses. So these are studies, cohort studies, where they'll look at the overall diet quality, they'll look at the intake of specific foods, and they'll essentially match up diet quality, they'll match up exercise, match up smoking, and so on through adjustments. And in those cases, they find that replacing red meat protein with plant protein still lowers risk. And that's after adjusting for those variables like diet quality, even saturated fat and fiber, and so on. So that suggests, based on those two findings, that one, there is still an increase in certain risk factors from red meat in randomized controlled trials. And then when we look at the long-term outcomes, there are still worse outcomes. It's still better than a fatty cut for sure, but it's not completely risk-free. And I think that's where people who like to include red meat more regularly have sort of a problem accepting that, even those in the sort of more middle ground, not talking necessarily about the carnivores. And that might in part be due to the dietary cholesterol. Like I said, it can still raise lipids a bit, not as much as saturated fat, but can still to a degree, and that'll depend on genetics a bit as well. That could be partially due to, again, the heme iron or other components of the red meat. And then that could be due to the fact that you're not getting as many of those like phytochemicals that you would otherwise get from plants. And there are certain phytochemicals that can improve lipids too. So these are a few potential explanations for those findings, but I wouldn't say that at least daily consumption of red meat, even if it's lean, is entirely safe. There's still some risk there. It's just not as much.
And what about like white meat? Was the risk pretty low with that if it's like you're eating like chicken breast every day?
So again, in substitution analyses, we still see that it's worse than the plant protein sources, but tends to be better than the red meat. And I would speculate that that's because it doesn't have the heme iron, it doesn't have a few other components, and there isn't as much data on white meat consumption with a wide enough range of intakes. So what I mean by that is when we're looking at studies on any food and whether it improves or worsens health outcomes, you need to have enough variety and intake in that population. So you need some people consuming it, say, every day, and some people consuming it almost never or very rarely. And that's how you'll actually see if there's a significant difference. If you're comparing, say, not consuming it to a couple times a week, you're probably not going to see much difference. And so there's actually very little studies looking at white meat with that sort of range of intakes, other than some of the, again, substitution analyses like the NIH AARP study, which showed some benefit to plant protein over white meats. But white meat would be certainly better than red meat. I would say that that's pretty clear based on the observational data. So I would opt for that over the red meat option from a health perspective.
And I think it was you and or maybe Simon that made a video about the claim that when you include more fruits and veggies in your diet, it offsets the risks of red meat. I'd love for you to expand on that because I think that's something that people misunderstand.
Yeah, so that's something Simon and I have both actually made videos about. I've made multiple, I think, on that. And so, yeah, that is something that is cited very often from individuals. Layne Norton would be one who cites it often, suggesting that if you eat more fruits and veggies, the risks of the red meat are mitigated. And that's based on a Canadian study, the either Tomorrow Alberta Project or the Alberta Tomorrow Project. I can't remember the order of the title. But basically what they did in this study was they looked at unprocessed red meat consumption. They looked at processed as well, but they separated them out. So I'll talk about unprocessed here. They looked at unprocessed red meat consumption and the risk of cancer. And then they divided people into those who eat very little fruits and veggies, moderate amounts, and higher amounts of fruits and veggies. And what they found was that in those eating the most fruits and veggies, unprocessed red meat was not associated with a higher risk of cancer, at least not statistically significantly. And so then people take that to claim, well, then fruits and veggies mitigate the risks. And there are a few issues with that. For one, the high red meat consumption in this cohort was about 500 grams per day, or the cutoff was 500 grams, per week, not per day. And that is less than a serving a day. And especially with cancer, we don't really see risk until at least a serving a day. So the amount of red meat may be too low to pick up on risk. So that's, caveat number one. The second issue is that they lumped cancers together. So they looked at total cancer and 15 cancers combined. They did not look at individual cancers like colorectal cancer. Now, that's the one that red meat is most consistently linked to. So we can't say based on this data that red meat doesn't increase colorectal cancer risk. A reason why is if you're eating more fruits and veggies and lowering risk of other cancers, but still getting a higher risk of colorectal cancer from the red meat, it could be the case that there's just no net increase in cancer risk, right? You understand how that could work there. And so that's a big problem. Now, the third issue I have with concluding from that study that that there aren't risks to red meat with high fruit and veggie intake is that this is only looking at cancer. What about cardiovascular risk? And we have similar studies looking at cardiovascular risk. There was one, I believe it was a Danish study that looked at ischemic heart disease, and those with the highest diet quality who consumed more red meat still had higher risk, unprocessed red meat still had higher risk of ischemic heart disease, significantly higher risk, about double or triple the risk. Mind you, that absolute risk was relatively low. Um, there's also the Zong. There was the author is Zong. There was 6 pooled cohorts in the U.S. If you look at those with the highest diet quality, again, unprocessed red meat was still associated with higher risk of cardiovascular disease. And then there was one third study I can think of that I can send you afterwards. I can't recall the name of it or the population, but found that there was a borderline statistically significant increase in risk of cardiovascular disease in those with the highest fruit and vegetable intake. And so we are seeing that even if I were to grant that there isn't an increase in net cancer risk, perhaps there's still potentially cardiovascular risks. So we shouldn't just wash all that away based on a single study with the issues I mentioned on cancer, because that's not the only outcome I would care about.
You'll hear people say like health foods that are touted as being healthy, like certain snacks and the Impossible Burgers are actually like damaging for your health. You'll hear people say that. Would it be accurate for you to claim, given what you've just said, that red meat is like a health food that is being put up on this pedestal that is quietly like destroying people's hearts over time?
Well, yeah, I mean, I wouldn't necessarily consider it a health food. If I was to look at like animal protein sources, I don't want people to say like, hey, he's a vegan, he's super biased. Like, I would have no problem saying that fish is a health food. I would have no problem saying that like fermented dairy or certain other like low fat dairy products are health foods. That is the case based on the data, and I'm not going to let the fact that I'm vegan sway my presentation of that. I don't see that with red meat. When it comes to actual health outcomes, like long term non communicable disease risk, I haven't really seen any data suggesting that red meat lowers risk of the vast majority of our leading killers. Um, and so if people are putting it up there as a health food, I think, yeah, absolutely. They're putting it up there as a health food that actually probably isn't all that healthy if consumed regularly. And then going the other way with things like, you mentioned plant-based meats, I would say the opposite is sort of the case. I wouldn't necessarily call them health foods per se, but I would say they're healthier alternatives from a cardiovascular standpoint compared to red meat based on the data that we have.
Well, and I think that people are saying red meat is like the multivitamin that people need and all this, right? And so that's kind of where I was going.
I see, I see.
I know a common thing that can be hard for people is getting enough protein when they're on a plant-based diet. And I know eating more protein has now become a more popular trend because of its importance for muscle building and strength. Like, what is your advice for somebody who maybe is wanting to incorporate more plants in their diet but doesn't want to sacrifice protein?
Yeah, so it certainly takes a bit more knowledge or a bit more effort. Like that I don't think anybody is arguing. Now, what I tell people to do is think about when you're, say, eating an omnivorous diet. Your plate might, if you're eating a healthy omnivorous diet, let's say, your plate is typically, having some fruits and veggies, maybe you have some whole grains there, and then you have whatever like meat portion that might be. And so the rest of it can stay roughly the same. Maybe you have to tweak a couple little ingredients here or there, but it's that meat portion, the high protein portion that you need to swap. And so you want to swap that for other high protein foods. You don't want to just flip that out or swap that out and just add extra brown rice or something. That's not going to necessarily bolster the protein content. So when you're replacing, say, your typical 80-20 beef, we'll talk about lean beef in a second. But if you're replacing that with plant protein sources and you replace it with an equivalent amount of calories from, say, tofu, you get about the same amount of protein. If you were to replace it with like a seitan or a textured vegetable protein, which is often like a defatted soy, it's very meaty in texture or can be very meaty in texture and is available at most grocery stores, just a lot of people don't necessarily look for it. That can be a really high protein source that matches even the lean cuts of meat. If you have eggs and you replace that with tofu or like a chickpea omelet, or even depending on the type of bean, like baked beans, you can get a similar amount of protein. If you replace dairy with soy milk or pea milk, you can get similar or even more protein depending on the fat content of the milk you're replacing. So these higher protein options do exist. It just takes a little bit of education around like what those are, how to prepare them. But once you get into the swing of things and like kind of know how to prepare it, maybe you made them a couple times, it becomes a lot easier. So that's something that I tell people to focus on is center each of your meals around a protein rich plant food. And if needed, like pretty much everybody else who goes to the gym does, take a protein shake. It's really easy to just, slam a protein shake after a workout and it'll tie you over till dinner or whatever it is. And that takes a lot of the sort of thought out of managing your protein intake.
Yeah, and there's nothing wrong with like taking a protein shake to the gym. I know those have been demonized over the years too, but I think there's nothing wrong with.
Yeah, 100%.
I know one of the reasons that people like to go carnivore or keto or low carb or whatever you want to call it is because they want to drop some body fat, and people have been convinced that over the years that in order to get to a certain point weight wise or to lose visceral fat, you have to like cut out carbs. I know visceral fat's got a lot of attention, recently because of its health risks. Like, what do you believe would be like the most optimal diet to reduce visceral fat while also indexing for longevity?
So the primary focus is just on a caloric deficit, whether that's from carbohydrates or fat. It doesn't matter. If you're dropping fat due to a calorie deficit, some of it's going to come out of that visceral fat or ectopic fat, and some of it will be subcutaneous, and the proportions are largely genetically determined. But there are certain things that might lead to more fat accumulation, say in the liver or around the organs, versus other, say, nutrients or foods. For example, if you're eating an excess of calories, so this is going the opposite direction, and you're getting more of it from saturated fat, that actually leads to more fat accumulation in the liver than even carbohydrates. Whereas like polyunsaturated fats appear to be better, things from, the fats from like nuts and seeds or the seed oils that everyone demonizes. Those actually lead to less liver fat accumulation and potentially less visceral fat accumulation, but in an overfeeding state. So when it comes to losing that, it's all about a caloric deficit. It doesn't matter whether it's carbs or fat that you're losing. Carbs or fats that you're decreasing. But it's about just maintaining that caloric deficit, and obviously exercise helps as well.
Yeah. And, speaking of seed oils, I think that, I have friends of mine that are super anti seed oil. I'm not a seed oil I don't, comment on it because I guess don't see the benefit of talking about it or not talking about it enough just because, I'm like, I don't think in itself they're that bad. I think processed foods are the problem. That's my kind of opinion. What's your take on seed oils? Like, what does the data actually say? Should people be as scared of them as people have said, if past guests on my show have said? Like, what is your take on that?
Yeah, I think they're the most like wrongfully demonized food out there. You can look at any diet camp, whether it's the plant-based camp, whether it's the keto camp, the carnivore camp, they all demonize seed oils. And it largely stems from a couple ideas. So one of the ideas is that seed oils, they're rich in this omega-6 fat called linoleic acid, and that could theoretically be converted into arachidonic acid, which is potentially inflammatory. And so they basically claim that seed oils are inflammatory. However, if you actually look at the randomized controlled trials that we have on seed oil consumption and inflammatory markers or arachidonic acid levels, it doesn't increase arachidonic acid. It doesn't increase inflammation under typical conditions. Now, the second thing that gets brought up is that, well, it upsets the balance of omega-6s and omega-3s, and you want a good ratio or at least closer to 1-to-1 ratio, if not like a 4-to-1 ratio of those fats to maximize the conversion of the omega-3 into the long-chain omega-3 fats that you would otherwise consume from, say, like fish and so on. However, more recent data has suggested that ratio, we actually don't know if there's an optimal ratio, and the ratio ultimately doesn't seem to really matter. What ultimately matters is that that you're getting enough of each. So, for example, omega-3s are generally even more healthy than omega-6s, but omega-6s are also healthy. And so if you have a say, smaller ratio of omega-6s to omega-3s, you generally have better outcomes because the omega-3s are even better than the omega-6s. It's not that the omega-6s are bad. And so that gets sort of misrepresented. And then the third thing that people bring up are a couple randomized controlled trials that may suggest harm from seed oils. And these are the Minnesota Coronary Experiment and Sydney Diet Heart Study. And both of them likely used trans fat rich margarines at the time as their seed oil interventions. And we know now trans fats are very bad, but they didn't really know at the time back in these were like the 70s, I believe. Um, so unfortunately, they were testing trans fats, not just your normal seed oils. And then also in the Minnesota study, like three-quarters of people dropped out before a year anyway. So it's not like we have very good data from that one. And if we look at better trials like the LA Veterans Administration Hospital study or meta-analysis that was done in the Presidential Advisory for Dietary Fats, we see that actually replacing saturated fats with these seed oil rich, unsaturated fat rich seed oils is beneficial for cardiovascular risk. So we see very consistently that they're beneficial, and we can even measure adipose tissue levels or blood levels of omega-6 fats and higher levels of the linoleic acid are associated with reductions in risk. So like very consistently, the data points toward benefit. But at the same time, I wouldn't say anybody needs to consume them. Like if you have any concerns whatsoever about seed oils, just have like olive oil or avocado oil. They're fantastic options. It's not like I'm telling people they need to have seed oils to reap these benefits. You can get them other ways.
Yeah, and I often wonder, like, is the seed oil conversation, and now it's like cholesterol and stuff like that, like LDL, like, are these like real things that people are bringing up, or do you think it's just like a fake nutrition war that's being created in a way to just generate content and buzz around people, so like profiles and stuff?
Well, I suspect that some people know what they're doing, and then some people genuinely believe what they're saying. So it's hard to know who's doing what. But like, I mean, you see people like Paul Saladino contradict himself all the time. Like you'll see him in one video. Simon actually made a hilarious video showing this, where he's like, animal studies are not great. They don't translate to humans very often. And then in the next video, literally like the next one he posts, he's citing animal studies to support his point. And so like you see stuff like that very often from a lot of them. And in those cases, I suspect that they're very aware that they are being dishonest here, and that's what it is. But then I think some people truly believe what it is that they're saying and are just misled. Or maybe they haven't really delved into the literature, but they're repeating what they've heard from other people or what have you. So hard to say what proportions are each in those cases.
Another thing I'd love for you to get into that even I've questioned at times when it comes to research, and I'm not the best at reading it, but I make my own observations, is healthy user bias. Like, some people will say when people like reduce their consumption of red meat, they're also probably, shopping at Whole Foods and exercising and walking more. And that's also offsetting the risk. I mean, talk about your perspective on that and where people may or may not be misled.
Yeah, so people actually misuse the term healthy user bias, and you actually did there as well, but I'll explain why. It's not to poke any fun. It's very
Here to learn.
I used to as well until I was corrected on this. So it's just a very common thing. So healthy user bias is actually the propensity of people who enter into studies to be more health conscious. So if you're going to enroll in a study that's assessing, the health value of a certain intervention or whatever, you're more likely to be health conscious than the general population. Okay, that's what healthy user bias really is. Now, what you define is something called multicollinearity. So this is the propensity for multiple variables to correlate in the population, right? So it's a little bit different. It's like if we wanted to enroll a study looking at red meat consumption and heart disease risk, there would be a healthy user bias, and then people who enter the study would be more health conscious in general than the average population. But the say correlation between red meat consumption and like smoking or sedentary lifestyle, that would be considered multicollinearity, and obviously it's most often referred to as healthy user bias. So basically the idea is that the reason we see that red meat is harmful in studies is because people who eat more red meat are just less healthy in general. They're doing other things that aren't healthy. The reason that say fruits and vegetables might be shown to be healthy in studies is that people who eat more fruits and vegetables are also exercising more, they're avoiding smoking, and so on. Like that's the idea. Well, there's a couple issues with that. So for one, researchers do adjust for these variables. So by doing that, they essentially look at how well each variable tracks with whatever outcome you're measuring, and then they remove that from the end result. It's basically like matching people up based on smoking habits, exercise, and so on. So you have, non-smokers compared to non-smokers, exercisers compared to exercisers, and on and on and on. Now, that's not a perfect process, but it's good enough. And there's a couple of reasons that we know that it's good enough. For one, if it were true that the reason that, say, fruits and vegetables appeared to be healthy in these studies was because they were doing these other healthy behaviors, when you adjust for those other behaviors, like when you adjust the result for exercise, the results should get less precise. And so there's like a range of values that we get in these studies. You'll have like, okay, there was a 25% increase in risk or decrease in risk, but there'll be a range of like 35% to 15% or something, which could encompass the values. That should get wider if you adjust for a variable that is very closely linked to what we're testing. And that doesn't happen. Usually it gets tighter. So that's issue one. The second thing is we actually have studies directly comparing results from these cohort studies to randomized controlled trials. And when you have studies designed in a similar way, so they're on similar populations, they're looking at a similar food or nutrient, and they're testing the same outcome, well, then the results align very well with randomized controlled trials. If it were the case that these observational studies or cohort studies were unreliable, they wouldn't correlate with the randomized controlled trial data very well if we believe the randomized trials to be sort of top tier. So there's multiple reasons that's an issue, or that claim has issues, because the data that we have just supports that no, actually these adjustments are pretty good and we're able to account for those variables fairly well. Is it possible that there's some like outstanding or residual confounding or something? Absolutely. I wouldn't rule that out entirely. But when we have consistent data across different populations, different study designs done by different research groups on the same variable, and we're getting similar outcomes, we can be pretty confident in the results. And I think that's something that is often missing from the conversation. People tend to believe that we'll base it on this single new study came out. It's like, no, this study shows what all these other studies before it also showed, and that just further gives us reason to believe that those results are true.
Yeah, and speaking of like things that often get missed, Simon and I have talked extensively on the show about nutrition gets a lot of airtime on social media, and exercise just for some reason doesn't. And I think it's because everybody knows like exercise is good for you, and people it's hard to argue like the benefits of that. That being said, taking a step back out of nutrition for a moment, like talk about like why people should focus on exercise as it pertains to the benefits of longevity.
Oh, we have, I mean, plenty of data on exercise. And what's funny, as you mentioned that everyone believes exercise is healthy, the type of data that we have on exercise that shows reductions in heart disease risks, cancers, and all that, the same type of data that we have on nutrition. They're primarily prospective cohort studies, which is sort of funny that people accept that in that context. Um, but yeah, like, I mean, if we look at randomized controlled trials on biomarkers, we see obviously weight loss, we can see improvements in muscle mass, we can see improvements in glycemic control or management, reductions in blood pressure, and actually interesting, maybe a bit of a side note here, but there were some recent studies looking at types of exercise and blood pressure. And this is an aside, but I think it's interesting. And the types of exercise, if you were to pick one that seemed to be the best, were isometric. So these are exercises where you're not necessarily moving your body. So it'd be like a plank or a wall sit where you're just holding that sort of tension, which I just thought was an interesting note to throw out there. But we have those short-term studies looking at improvements in those biomarkers. And then we have the long-term cohort studies where people will report how much they exercise. And of course, you try to account for other variables like diet quality and smoking and so on. And you see that very consistently, greater exercise is associated with reductions in risk of a number of outcomes that I already mentioned. And there seemed to be some additive benefit between resistance training at least once a week, if not more, and then aerobic training more frequently.
Yeah, I mean it's such a great tool for people, and especially I think I look at like from a mental health perspective. I think there's in my mind a direct correlation between your body and your mind. And if you keep your body sharp, I think your mind will follow. And it's sad to see that, like we said before, like exercise doesn't get as much airtime because I think in many cases people miss the plot, and people follow these diet trends and they're like, hey, like I want to do this like 7-day fast, or I want to cut out seed oils, or I want to go vegan. But then it's like, well, why don't you are you exercising? Are you moving your body? And like, well, I mean, isn't the fast going to help me lose the weight? And it's like, well, you're missing the point. Like you're missing the point of like the fact that if you care about longevity and living longer, then should be something you're going to be doing for the rest of your life, not just for the next like 3 weeks.
And I think that comes back to what I was talking about with like carnivore earlier. It's the quick fix, right? If you did a fast for 3 days or whatever, I know that's one example you mentioned. It's like, okay, yeah, you'll lose some weight in those few days. Like lose a bit pretty quickly. But then, what do you do afterwards, and what are you planning to do for the long term to maintain that? And so that short term quick fix is just like really appealing, I think, to people.
Talk about autophagy, because I know that gets looped into the benefits of fasting. And I think I recently learned, and I don't know much about the data on this, that aerobic exercise, I think if like a 30-minute bout of aerobic exercise, I think did the same autophagy benefit as fasting or something. But I would love to hear your thoughts on all that.
Yeah. So I'm more familiar with the fasting literature as far as exercise and autophagy, not something I've looked into. I mean, I don't discuss a ton of like exercise science, but as far as like, fasting and so on, yes, there's this mechanistic finding that we see in like animal trials. Um, I'm actually not sure how well that's translated even on a mechanistic standpoint to humans at this point. But I haven't seen anything really suggesting that long term fasting leads to better outcomes. Like that's what I'm ultimately concerned with is at the end of the day, does it have a net benefit? And I'm not sure that it does. Again, it's not an area that I've like super thoroughly investigated. But yeah, I would want to see that at the end of the day, people who do this intermittently, say every, whether it's a couple weeks or month or however frequently it is, that actually leads to a lower risk of, say, cardiovascular disease, cancers, etc.
Going back to nutrition and talking about visceral fat and fat loss, etc. Like what types of foods within the caloric context would you recommend people eat while they're losing weight to maintain muscle and also like feel their best while they're dropping weight? This episode is brought to you by Live On Labs. If you are someone who is constantly stressed, feeling depleted, and exhausted, I have some exciting news. My friends at Live On Labs have an incredible deal I can offer you. When you buy any product at full price, you get a free carton of their highly popular B complex product, which I take every day. Taking a B complex supplement can also help support things like a healthy metabolism, increased energy, blood sugar balance, and learning. Vitamin B supplements can help replenish nutrients depleted from stress. Live On Labs puts years of research into each product, which is why I stand behind them. Using liposome encapsulation technology, these products promote elite absorption so the supplements get into your cells and give you the best benefits that you're looking for. Right now, you can get a free carton of Lipospheric B Complex Plus, which is a $56 value with any full price purchase from liveonlabs.com. This supplement has the B vitamins and minerals that you need to help turn food into sustained natural energy throughout the day. Just add B Complex Plus and any other full price supplement to your cart and enter code BOPES24 at checkout to get this amazing deal. Now back to the show.
I see. So when they're actively losing weight, that's not going to be a forever thing, right? They're going to lose weight for a little bit and then they'll maintain where they're happy, ideally. And so I'm not too concerned with like, are they getting X number of servings of vegetables or what have you, or fruits during that time, because you can modify that after the fact when they're in maintenance. What I'm more concerned with during that weight loss phase is actually protein intake. So you may have discussed this previously, where we see the plateaus for hypertrophy around 1.6 grams of protein per kilogram of body weight. But during weight loss, intake might actually be, or needs might actually have to be higher to maintain muscle mass. And so that's where you want to potentially jack that up to even like 2 or even slightly above 2 grams per kilogram of body weight. And so I would really focus on protein rich but low calorie foods. And if we're talking about like something that's really easy to do in that case, protein powders. So like being very generous with those if you're making shakes or anything, maybe not just one scoop, maybe you're having a couple scoops. If you're focusing on foods, I mean, you already talked about like lean meats in particular, but from the plant protein perspective, I would look at textured vegetable protein or TVP. I would look at seitan there because they're incredibly protein dense with very little calories. Those are the types of foods that I would look at emphasizing. And then, of course, depending on how they're feeling and how they generally do with carbohydrate intake, some people feel better on higher carb, some people feel better on lower carb. But I would say like some fruits and veggies, or fruits in particular, and potentially some whole grains to help support the carbohydrate side of things, and to hopefully maintain some of that energy might be a good idea. But that might be variable person to person. My primary focus would definitely be protein while still training, of course,
Are you familiar with like the protein from potatoes? I think Lane, when he was on here with Simon, talked about how that's like the best like form of like,
because of leucine.
yeah,
Yeah, because it's higher in leucine. Yeah, but I just haven't really seen it out there anywhere. Like, so I don't think it's super feasible from like I don't know how to source it or where you would source it from. So that'd be, I mean, maybe once it's scaled and more available, sure.
yeah. And going back to the carnivore discussion as it relates to just health and longevity, in talking about, I think, why people do it, I've heard that people's gut health feels better when they're on it because they access a pseudo elimination diet, if you will. And that's one of the reasons. But talk about, I guess, long term, your thoughts on red meat and gut health and how people should really eat if they want a healthy gut.
Okay, so let's start with the anecdotal experiences you mentioned there. So for one, I think some people definitely improve as far as gut health or symptoms on a carnivore diet, but also some people might happen to improve while adopting the diet. It's hard to know for sure based on these anecdotes because a lot of the gut symptoms tend to come and go, and it could be the case that they resolve around the same time that they adopted the diet. So that's number one. But let's say that it is related to the dietary changes and that their gut symptoms are resolving. Well, the carnivore diet's a pretty extreme elimination diet. Let's say, just for sake of argument, that somebody had issues with gluten for some reason and they remove all plant foods. Well, then they're going to remove gluten and they're going to feel better. Um, but they didn't have to remove the fruits and the veggies. They didn't have to remove non-gluten grains to experience that. And that's just one example. It could be any food within there that they had problems with. And that's why I advise those who are having GI symptoms to, work with a doctor and ideally a dietitian to actually go through their diet, maybe do a more structured elimination and then challenge those foods back in so that they can have a more well-rounded diet and ideally figure out what the problematic foods are. So that's the approach that I would take. Now, as far as red meat and gut function, I mean, there's some like mechanistic studies looking at um, uh, how they might in fact affect the lining of the gut and the passage of endotoxins into the bloodstream from I believe it's the lipopolysaccharides in the red meat that can impact the tight junctions or something like that. I might be misrepresenting the mechanism a little bit there. But again, I'm not overly concerned with the mechanistic side of things. I'm more concerned with the outcomes. And we do see that red meat consumption is associated with high risk of certain inflammatory bowel diseases, and some people might have more IBS symptoms along with it. But at the same time, that's super individual. I don't want to, claim that meat is going to be problematic for basically everybody. It's certainly not the case. I don't even know if, from a gut perspective, it'll be problematic for most people, but some people will be more sensitive to it, and that might be one reason that some people might have worse gut health on a carnivore diet, for example. I mean, you see those stories as well out there. So hard to pinpoint exactly what's going on there, but those are a couple speculations I can make.
And Simon and I have become really close friends over the years, and one of the reasons is because he's like challenged me a lot, and we have like really cool conversations because we don't agree on necessarily everything, but we're friends at heart, and we both can have these cool discussions. And one of the things that I learned from him was like the role that food environment plays on like people's ability to get healthy. I think a lot of what people say logically may make sense with moving more towards like grass fed stuff and local farms and stuff like that. But from an environment and a mass production standpoint, it's just not as realistic. I mean, I would love to hear if you have any thoughts on like the role that environment plays in people's ability to actually eat healthy.
So I think food environment and our food system in general is the biggest problem we have with making it difficult to eat a healthy diet. By far, I think access to healthy foods is challenging in certain areas. The cost of healthy foods is generally higher than the less healthy foods. We have advertisements on TV all day, every day. We have, you walk down the street here in Vancouver on at least one of the main strips, and you'll be braided with everything from like fast food burgers to milkshakes to this and that. It gets very challenging to block out all that noise. And some people are more affected by this food noise than others are. And so that's one reason that it's more difficult for some people to ignore and to make healthier choices than others. Of course, there's other mechanisms at play too. So I think food environment is absolutely massive. And one thing that I think has bigger potential to have a greater impact than say just even making fruits and veggies and things more accessible or cheaper. I think it's reformulating the a lot of the hyper palatable ultra processed foods that are out there. So I think reducing saturated fat content, reducing sodium content, increasing fiber if possible, things that we see happening in like the plant based meat sector right now. They're finding ways to make products healthier. If that was to be expanded, I think we could have a massive impact because it doesn't put as much onus on the consumers who are already berated by all of this and live busy lives. And what if you have a single mother of three who's working two jobs and caring for her kids? It's not reasonable to expect them to also be able to home cook all their meals and to make sure they're super nutritious and so on. And so, if we look at actually a great example, have you heard of the North Karelia project in Finland? Well, this is phenomenal. I think this is one of the best public health interventions of all time. And so what they did, Finland back in, I'm going to mess up the timeline here. I think it was the 80s, around there. They had some of the highest coronary heart disease rates in the world, particularly for men. And over the course of several years, they gathered with nutritional scientists and they worked with food industry. And they took out like advertisements for harms of smoking and smoking cessation and stuff too, and poured a lot of resources into that from a public health perspective. And they were able to cut the coronary heart disease risk by something like 80 or 83% by, for one, reducing the amount of smoking in the population, by lowering the saturated fat content of the diets, and this was largely due to food industry swapping out the types of fats that they're using. They lowered sodium content of the foods in the population by switching out salt for like potassium or magnesium based salts, and they were able to drop blood pressure, drop cholesterol, et cetera, and just massive success on a wide scale. And that's the type of intervention, the type of resources I think that need to be poured into a lot of these populations who are struggling with cardiovascular disease and so on. That is what I think will make the biggest impact by far, versus trying to just educate consumers, because you can educate them on what they maybe should be doing, but it's not easy to do that in today's day and age.
Right. And there's just so much information out there and people have different perspectives. And, I think what was right 5 years ago is now wrong. And what was, wrong last year is now right. And I think, getting into that conversation, like cholesterol, I think was, I guess, the holy grail of like seeing if your heart was actually healthy or not. Right. And same thing with like ApoB. And now people have commented on that and saying that that's kind of not the right thing to do. Um, like, what do you think are the health metrics that everybody should follow if you had to pick a few that would guide them on whether or not they're actually as healthy as they think they are?
Well, one of them is certainly ApoB. I don't know how anybody can argue that that's not like the most important marker for cardiovascular risk out there. Like we know from several lines of evidence now. We know from a mechanistic viewpoint in say like animal studies, we have randomized controlled trials where you reduce ApoB or ApoB containing lipoproteins with medications or diet, and you reduce risk of cardiovascular disease. We have Mendelian randomization studies where you look at people with genetically lower levels and they tend to have significantly lower risks of cardiovascular disease. And then you have the observational data on top of that. Like it's incredibly consistent, and I would say that that is definitely one of the most important markers. And you ideally want to keep that as low as possible. However, that's not typically measured on a standard lipid profile. What is typically measured are total cholesterol, LDL cholesterol, HDL cholesterol, triglycerides, and sometimes non-HDL cholesterol. So if non-HDL cholesterol is included, that's a good marker as well. And the ideal levels would be under about 2.6 millimoles per liter. For ApoB, it's about zero point 0.8 grams per liter or less. And then LDL cholesterol is also a good marker, but can be discordant with ApoB. So it makes up most of the ApoB containing lipoproteins, but in some people, it's not an accurate marker for ApoB, just based on other variables. So it's pretty good, could be better. But the ideal for that is about 1.8 millimoles per liter or less for people without other risk factors. So that's number one. The second one that is worth testing is hemoglobin A1C, which is a measure of your glycemic control or like blood sugar on average over the past few months. So that's a good one to see how you're managing glucose. Blood pressure is certainly a very easy. It's free in most cases to do in like a pharmacy or grocery store. So that's a really good one to check. Ideal seems to be under 110 over 70, although normal is labeled as 120 over 80. And then outside of that, measuring like ALT, alanine aminotransferase, which is a marker of liver function, it can be a sign of, if it's elevated, can be a sign of like fatty liver in particular, a good one to measure as well. But those would be some of the ones at the top of my list, just off the top of my head.
I think people are lost and they feel like they just lack hope because of the conflicting evidence online and what people are saying. Like if you were to give somebody like a little starter kit as a few things they should focus on right now if they want to improve their health outcomes, what should they do?
Yeah, I mean, well, one thing that you definitely emphasized earlier was exercise, and I think, look, if it's too much to ask to do 3, 4, 5 days a week, start with 1 or 2 days a week. Start somewhere. That makes a difference, or start with short breaks. If you're at work and you have 10-minute interventions that you can take to even go walk around the block or something, do that. Do some type of activity. There's going to be very little debate around that. I think that's one thing that most people are going to agree upon. Outside of that, I think now, I could hammer home this is how many servings of XYZ you should be consuming. I would say try to have vegetables at two of your meals in the day. Whether that's, a couple leaves of spinach or kale, or no, maybe more than a couple of spinach, but, a handful of spinach or kale in your smoothie if you're having that, or maybe it's a little side salad with your dinner, something like that, just to get some veggies in. And of course, snacking on fruits or nuts are excellent options as well. And then where you can, again, this could be as little as a couple times a week. Try to, if you're having, say, meat every day, try swapping it out for plant protein sources at least a couple times a week, just to get some variety, get a bit more fiber and a bit more of those phytochemicals. I think these are pretty simple or relatively simple things to try to incorporate as a starting point. And then from there, as you learn how to prepare these foods, as you become more comfortable with it, of course, you can expand, but start somewhere. To just make a goal, try to hit that for a few weeks in a row, and then progress from there if you're able to, or if not, you're still better off than where you were prior as far as your overall nutritional profile.
Obviously, I know you're very like skilled at reading research, and you've also mentioned that you are vegan, and that's like your choice in how you live your life. Like, how do you like? What's the battle like, if any, of separating your own bias from reading the literature and posting content?
See, I don't think I have that challenge. I think, like for me, I look at it maybe once upon a time. I had that more so, but when I look at it now, I feel that if I were to misrepresent something to suit my bias, I think I'm doing a disadvantage to the movement. I think it gives people fodder to sort of say like, hey, this guy's wrong or he's clearly biased, and then I think that hurts both my credibility and the credibility of the movement that I'm trying to represent. So I can be very honest, like I said, about fish being healthy, about certain dairy products being healthy, but at the same time not consume them and not necessarily advocate for them on grounds of the ethical views or so on. But I'm not going to lie about the health side of things. And I just don't think it helps the movement at all. And I know there might actually be some people who disagree. If some vegans are watching this, maybe they disagree with me, but that's just how I view it.
Is there anything you've changed your mind on in the last few years when it comes to nutrition?
Oh yeah. Well, last few, I've been more consistent, I'd say the last few, but if we went back even like 5 years, I would say I was in the camp that thought seed oils were harmful. Yeah, yeah. So once upon a time, so that's the other thing is people look at me and say, oh, he's biased. He's because he's vegan that he promotes seed oils as if those two are tied, even though I feel like most of the vegan community hates them. No, I used to be on that side and I was convinced otherwise. So I actually, if anything, that's the unbiased thing to do. So I switched my view on that. So that was one. I used to think that we didn't need, or need is a strong word, that we didn't benefit from higher intakes of protein, well beyond the RDA. I've changed my view on that. I do think it's more important. Trying to think of what else I would have come to here. I don't know. If I thought about it more, I can come up with more. But those are a couple that I can just pull from my head there.
I appreciate you sharing that because I never would have thought the seed oil thing. I mean, I think that it could make sense because if you think about like a lot of fried, like meat is fried in seed oils, right? Like chicken and stuff like that. But that's interesting. No, thanks for sharing that.
Yeah, no, it had nothing to do with that either. It had nothing to do with like the meat, or it was just like the arguments around like inflammation or omega-6 ratio or whatever, like those types of arguments, um, before I became as well informed. Actually, maybe it was more than 5 years. I don't know. I can't remember timeline, but at a point I wasn't as well informed on the topic, and I bought into a lot of the same things that a lot of others buy into now, and I was just convinced otherwise.
Yeah, that's really like cool to hear that, because I think like the people that can't admit that they've changed their mind is like they're people you shouldn't really like. It's hard to trust. It's like, wait a second, you've never been wrong. What- you know, I know we've picked on the carnivore community a bit, and I think it's fair to also. Not, I don't want to I mean when I say pick on, it's more like clear up and clarify. Let's talk about like the other extreme, like vegan. Like, what are some things that you think vegans often miss in the context of health based on research?
Yeah, so I mean, there's a few. I think they demonize fish on the grounds that they can, contain certain amounts of heavy metals. The thing is, when we look at the health outcomes again, the actual risks of XYZ long-term health outcome, we see benefits typically, or at worst neutral. So I don't think there doesn't appear to be a net negative. So that's one thing I think they get wrong. Another one is, and this drives me nuts. I feel like it's a small thing, like it's not as consequential, but you'll often hear people in the plant-based community say that like cheese is addictive because of these like opioid like compounds in them. Have you heard that? The casomorphins?
No, but I used to be an opioid addict, so I can't see, I can't see how that would make sense.
So I didn't know that, but yeah, no, it's basically what they say is that the casein in cheese can be converted to casomorphins when we consume them, and that has some structural similarities to certain types of like opioids, and then that can interact with receptors in the brain that causes sort of addictive response. And that's sort of the argument they present for why apparently it's hard to give up cheese. However, there's some issues in that casomorphin largely gets degraded in the gut, and the amount that does make it into the blood doesn't typically make it to the brain, so it doesn't even make any sense. But it's something that's often repeated, so that's one that drives me nuts. But like you just demonstrated, I don't think a lot of people outside of the vegan community have heard that, so that's good news, I guess. Maybe I've just presented it to people, unfortunately, and now they're going to run with it. So there's that. I'm trying to think of what else. Oh, I think a lot of them disregard or downplay the importance of protein to a pretty substantial degree. Like some people suggest we should get even less than the RDA, which already isn't very much in the plant-based community, and I think that's problematic. And then some of them basically say that animal protein full stop causes cancer, and again, that doesn't make a lot of sense. As an isolated protein, if anything, it's what's packaged with certain protein sources, but yeah, I think there's a number of things that are propagated in the plant-based community, but fortunately, I've seen it less and less over the last couple of years. I feel like there's a movement away from some of those more extreme views.
Yeah, and even like I mean, talking with Simon, he's like, his audience. I don't think he wants it to be all plant based. He wants it to be just people focused on health and getting better.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah, which I think it's great because I think even like Stan Efferding. Stan. You understand? He's the big Jack.
I don't like follow his stuff a lot, but I do follow him on social media, so I see it every now and then.
And I know, I think I know he listens to like Simon's podcast and he loves his podcast. I think he's also mentioned that he consumes your stuff, and it's like I think that's really cool to see because you would think a guy like that may not be someone who enjoys, but Stan's a great guy, very nuanced with his approach. I know he's changed his mind on stuff. He's an avid learner. He's been on the podcast a bunch. Great dude, but it just shows that I just think people I think are trying to move towards this idea of longevity because people are realizing that in general that like the short-term chase it only works so long, you know what I mean, like if anything until it doesn't, and then you're kind of like screwed. And with health, like the unfortunate thing is, and I'm sure you've seen this a lot in your practice, I've seen it a lot as a trainer, like people wait until like the last minute to change. And like with your health, it's different than like leaving a relationship. It's like, you're in the doctor's office because just had a heart attack. I mean, it's like it's life or death.
Yeah, no, it's much easier to be proactive, or at least, yeah, it's much easier to be proactive and prevent something from happening than try to treat it after the fact and get back to where you were beforehand. Like sometimes it's not even possible. So, yeah, I think where we can to be proactive is definitely really good to do for our long-term health or longevity.
I'd love to hear your thoughts on diabetes. I think when I had Simon and Elaine on, they both agreed that the biggest way to reduce your risk of diabetes was to lose weight. Is that still the number one thing?
That's accepted. Yeah, that's like widely accepted. Roy Taylor's work in particular. I think I don't know if Simon's had him on his show. If not, I'm going to suggest he should. But he's sort of the one who really elucidated these mechanisms, and basically, um, I'll try to give the short version. We each have what we'd call our like personal fat threshold. There's a certain amount of body fat that we can put on before we develop diabetes. And the more that you put on, the more difficult it becomes to manage that glucose metabolism. And I mean, there's multiple mechanisms by which this can occur. The mainly described by what's called the twin cycles hypothesis, but I won't like nerd out too hard right now. I'll just talk about the fat threshold side. So basically, there's a certain amount of fat that you can put on, and at a point you develop insulin resistance and type 2 diabetes. Now, that is going to vary person to person based on genetics. And also, there are some certain ethnic groups that have higher risk because they have lower fat thresholds. So, for example, South Asians, I'm of South Asian background myself, we tend to have a lower personal fat threshold, which is one reason that diabetes is more rampant in India than, say, in North America or parts of Europe. Same sort of deal with like East Asia. And so, weight loss really helps, prevent or improve the condition, or even put it into remission if it's substantial enough. So we see from Roy Taylor's work where basically they gave people low calorie diets with like meal replacement, protein shake type things, and vegetables. That was basically their diet. They lost a bunch of weight, and those who lost the most weight, almost all of them achieved remission of type 2 diabetes, which is unbelievable. That's far more than we see with virtually any medication or other like lifestyle intervention. So weight loss is definitely number one, but again, it's not easy, right? It's something that is difficult to do in a lot of cases unless you're going to those measures of, very low calorie diet, meal replacement shakes, etc. But that is by far the most well agreed upon mechanism.
How does insulin intersect with diabetes? I mean, I think the old school methodology was like if you have diabetes, just like don't eat sugar. Like, what is your position on that, and how has that research evolved?
So yeah, if you have diabetes, you have insulin resistance, and you consume sugar or carbohydrates, and you then raise your blood glucose, and you need insulin to help bring that down, but you're not producing much insulin, that's a problem, and your blood glucose can remain high. But it's not the sugar per se that caused the diabetes in the first place. It's the fact that you're not able to deal with the sugar because you're not producing enough insulin, or the insulin receptors aren't responding. And so what happens is, as you accumulate body fat, especially around the organs or in the liver and pancreas, your ability to respond to those glucose rises diminishes. So as blood sugar goes up, um, if you have gotten to a point where there's more fat in the pancreas, you're not producing as much insulin. But also, if you have more fat in the liver, your insulin receptors aren't as sensitive, and so they don't respond to the insulin. And that is the primary issue. So again, even if you're eating carbohydrates a fair bit, but you lose weight and you drop some of that fat in and around those organs, you can then respond better to the carbohydrates in your bloodstream. And so that is, again, why the weight loss aspect is by far number one. But in people with diabetes, especially if it's pretty advanced, eating huge amounts of fast absorbing carbohydrates probably isn't the best idea until you're able to better deal with that. That doesn't mean you have to go like super low carb or anything, but I would maybe sidestep the like Coca-Colas and things like that in the meantime.
Yeah, I think there's something similar with gut health. I think Simon was talking about it at one point where there was a study done. I don't know if you're familiar with it. I'm sure you probably are. That they took people who had unhealthy guts, and if you fed them like fiber, it messed their gut up like even more or something like that. Is that is that true?
I've heard Simon reference that before. I can't remember the details of the study, but we see of that particular study. But we do see across the literature that if you take people with, say, gut symptoms, depending on the particular condition and whether they're in like a flare of that condition, and you ramp up fiber, it can actually exacerbate symptoms. Now, that doesn't mean that fiber is bad for the gut. It just means during that period, it's probably best to limit and then slowly reintroduce. And for prevention of even things like inflammatory bowel diseases, while you may need to limit fibers during a flare, having fiber regularly actually helps prevent it in the first place, or prevent those flares in the first place. So there's a bit of nuance there around the fiber commentary.
And when people are feeling like bloated, traditionally, like what do you typically see going wrong?
Oh, that's such a non-specific symptom. It could be a million things. It could be celiac disease. It could be certain food sensitivities. It could be IBS or inflammatory bowel diseases. It's really hard to say. That's something that would have to be like thoroughly investigated. You'd have to test for like hypothyroidism and celiac and all of those. And then if everything checks out, then you'd probably look at more of a food sensitivity or IBS type picture where you want to maybe do some type of a food diary and or elimination diet, and try to hone in on if there are, any particular foods or food groups that are problematic.
Well, regarding like an intervention for like the person that we were talking about who's got the problematic gut, they're being told to eat more fiber, they're eating more fiber, and it's messing things up. Could eating like fermented foods like help offset that? Is there anything that they could do like while also trying to eat more fiber that wouldn't mess their gut up so much?
Honestly, I haven't seen anything like super impressive for fermented foods in particular in that regard. But again, as for like what is causing those symptoms or what would help prevent the symptoms, you'd need a thorough workup because it could be such a wide variety of things. Like that's the issue with gut health a lot of the time. I feel like on social media, especially, we'll see people with like this single solution to all your gut problems, and they'll sell you this idea when it's so complicated. It's actually one of the areas I don't think we understand very well to this point. Like we know certain conditions and we know interventions that will help those specific conditions. But then when it comes to more non-specific, just symptoms and everything else checks out well, it's more difficult to hone in on what is causing that, and it takes a lot more trial and error.
What are some of the like biggest myths you see online that either you react to the most or ones that just drive you nuts that actually is like damaging people's health?
So I mean, we already talked about seed oils. Don't need to do that again. I think there's the idea that animal protein's inherently superior to plant protein, and that like soy is estrogenic. Those are probably by far the two most common ones.
It was like, yeah, soy leads to like man boobs. Wasn't that the correlation?
Yeah, that well, and that was based on or where it stemmed from was a single case study of a guy who was having like like basically a soy only diet. I always get I need to check again for the number of servings, but it was something like 14 or 12 servings a day or more. Like a ridiculous intake, and it's not even clear if the breast growth was due to the soy. It could have been many other things. It was just a single case. But even if we granted that it was the soy, like I mean, nobody's recommending that amount anyway. And at intakes of 3 to even 5 servings a day, we don't see any adverse effects on hormone health. So it's totally fine and healthy to eat. It's very nutritious, very protein rich, and we have numerous randomized controlled trials to back that up.
I saw you. Were you reacting to something about energy drinks? Was that yesterday or the other
Oh
day?
yeah, that was, yeah, yesterday I posted that. Yeah.
So what was the thesis around that?
Yeah, so I get a lot of questions about energy drinks, and I was sent a clip of some guy basically saying that they cause brain fog or something, and so I just wanted to like set the record straight, and basically if I mean if people want the full video, it's like 4.5 minutes. It's one of my longer ones, and can certainly watch that. But the short of it is that um, energy drinks in general, at least here in Canada, in the States, they can get insanely high in caffeine content. In Canada, there's a limit, and it's 180 milligrams per can, so it's not that high. But yeah, they can be a source of caffeine. They can be great for pre workouts. They can improve cognitive function on a number of tests. Um, I would certainly steer clear of the sugary ones. So the sugar free ones are generally going to be better from a cardiometabolic standpoint. And as far as potential risks, I mean, some people don't tolerate caffeine. Certainly not recommended in pregnancy or for children or teens, particularly young teens. Um, and most of the additives are either benign or also ergogenic, so they might promote performance. However, the doses of a lot of the additives are too low to actually provide those benefits. So I feel like a lot of the time it's just so that they can advertise it, like, hey, it contains this, even though it's not going to do anything. And then the one ingredient that I highlighted in that video that I think is worth being a bit cautious around is carnitine. So L-carnitine is an amino acid like compound that it's actually found in meat, but often added to energy drinks. And there is a randomized trial that was done in women with metabolic syndrome where supplementation with L-carnitine, I believe it was at 2 grams a day, led to progression of atherosclerosis at 6 months. And then if we look at people with higher levels genetically of L-carnitine, there's some association between that and cardiovascular events as well. So I'm a bit cautious around the energy drinks that have L-carnitine. If used regularly, once in a while is not a big deal. But also, the doses might be too low to cause any sort of problems or benefits anyway. So it's one of those things where I would say, out of an abundance of caution, someone might want to limit that. But that might be just being overcautious because it might be too low of a dose to care anyway. And we have pretty limited data in that respect. And I just like to play it safe when possible.
Yeah, I drink Celsius fairly regularly, and people will text me being like, "Oh my god, you know what's in that, like taurine and stuff like that." I'm like, "Well,
What's wrong with Tori?
yeah." But I mean, I'm trying to lower my blood pressure, so maybe I will cut down on my caffeine intake. That's an easy, I think, win to do that.
Well, here's the thing with blood pressure too, though. I mean, we see that with coffee, but it's usually an acute consumption. So, like, if you don't regularly consume caffeine and then you have it, it can raise blood pressure for a bit. But if you have it regularly, that effect diminishes. So, if you are having it regularly, it might not have much of an effect. Obviously, you can do a trial, right? You can remove it and see if your blood pressure comes down and see how that goes. But it's actually a lot of people believe that it really affects blood pressure, but it doesn't seem to really be the case if you have caffeine regularly, whether that's coffee or like these beverages.
Yeah. So what are your like big like health goals like moving forward? Is it just longevity, just doing what you're doing, or do you have anything you're chasing after?
I mean, for health, yeah, it's just about being healthy, living a long and healthy life. Preventing these long term diseases that have or these chronic diseases that may have affected others in my family. Um, and I mean, I feel like that's a similar goal to what most have. But then I have a lot of fitness goals. Like I'm a soccer player in particular. Up until last year, I was playing on like three teams simultaneously. So I'm always working on speed and strength around that. I'm not looking to become huge or anything, but definitely working to build the leg strength as well with to help with the sprinting and power, and kicking and stuff like that. So I have some fitness goals around that. I've done marathons and stuff in the past. I don't really see myself doing that again anytime soon. So yeah, more so the speed and like strength to weight ratio.
Could you ever see yourself like having a dinner with somebody in the carnivore community?
Maybe if they let me film it and we debate something.
I know you've debated a handful of people, I think, right on
Yeah.
Simon's show.
I debated Tucker Goodrich on seed oils on Simons. It was like 4 hours, and then I've debated Anthony Chafee on another channel, who's a carnivore proponent. And then I've done some like Instagram live debates and stuff on various topics with like carnivores or otherwise. Um, it's just like I don't know what we'd talk about, and I'd really like to debate some of these people who actively avoid debates. Like people like Paul Saladino. I know he's not carnivore anymore, but he often like he'll say publicly that he's like open to debating anybody, but then he won't debate any people who have any debate experience. Like he's very selective about that. So he like gives the illusion to his followers that he's willing to debate, but he's actually not. So like I love to sit down with one of those people and like hash it out.
Yeah, Sean Baker had DM'd me about coming on the pod, and I was like, "I'll do it if Simon can be on too." And I think he was gay. I just couldn't get it scheduled. I mean, everybody's schedule was kind of, but I would love to see. I would have loved to have hosted that. I mean, the problem is, I think the problem with debates, and I'm sure you've experienced this, is that people get so like emotionally like charged that I even had said to Sean and Simon when we were going back and forth, I was like, all right, well, my main rule is it has to be like civil, and like there's no like screaming, and there's no like taking clips and reacting to it. It's like we're gonna have a conversation on the podcast for the benefit of the audience and make sure we hammer home the right topics and have the questions in advance, but the main idea is to be respectful. That was like the biggest takeaway I think from my conversations with Lane and Simon was I got a lot of messages and comments that like they were very respectful of each other, and they were like, wow, I'm super like thankful to see two people that I wouldn't expect to agree like be like kind to each other. I just think if we could have more of that, I think it would do the benefit of people getting their points across and being like heard, while also the audience being able to like decide for themselves, like, oh, like what makes the most sense to me. I think when people scream, certain people, I should say, obviously it's not, I haven't heard you do that or everyone. It's like they try to get, it's their way of gaining authority, but really like people are like, why are you screaming ever talking about steak?
Yeah, no, and I think what you said about the like questions in advance and all that, I think that is key. Like to have a when I've tried to schedule debates with people, a lot of the time they're super like vague, wishy washy. They want it to be just open because in those cases it's very easy to like swivel around certain topics, right? But if you have it laid out, like, hey, these are the topics we're hitting, we'll do them one at a time, and it's very focused, I think that's how you have a productive conversation. And then as a moderator, of course, trying to keep it centered on that topic, right? Those are the conversations I think actually bring the most value. But the problem I've run into, especially when I've done debates without a moderator, is they're often trying to get out of that topic because maybe they're being pressed in a way that they aren't comfortable with. And yeah, obviously I don't think. I mean, a shouting match isn't going to help anybody either, right? But these are the like I think what you're describing there. I would have loved to have seen that, if that were to take place, but I unfortunately didn't happen.
I was like, this would have been cool because I try to stay out of the nutrition echo chambers. I have friends on and I don't, pick who I spend time with based on how they eat. I'm like, oh, like it's a person, a good person. Like I spend time with them, but I also, I see some of the wars that exist and I'm like, I wish we could kind of change this. I bring this up. I brought this up a number of times on the podcast. I had Juliet and Kelly Starrett on the show, and they wrote the book "Becoming a Supple Leopard," which was a huge like mobility and flexibility book that came out years ago. And they said, we've done a really good job at getting the fitness enthusiasts, the health enthusiasts healthy. We've done a really poor job at getting the general population healthier. And I thought that really hit home with me because we've created so much confusion online and in logical sense just doesn't make sense anymore with some of the things that people say. Um, well, Matt, this has been incredible. I've really loved this conversation. I've learned a lot. I think you're incredible what you do. You're very gifted, very wise, and I appreciate you coming on. I think there's going to be a lot of value in this conversation for people.
No, thanks for having me. It's been a good conversation, and certainly bringing up a lot of, I think, hot topics, and hopefully can provide my side of it and some clarity. But yeah, I'm happy to, of course, come on again if there's any other topics that you want to discuss another time.
Yeah, I definitely love to have you back on. I mean, I really enjoy this. I learn. I like hearing from people that are smarter than me and that also can just provide evidence with a nuanced approach. So thank you.
Thanks.